Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and today we're dressing up in our suit of lies. Yeah! All right, have fun, guys. All right, so our script writers have let us know that it's time to say goodbye to the Vikings, right? And more specifically, it's time to say goodbye to the notion that Vikings look like this guy. A notion apparently introduced in the dreaded 1860s. Right over here. And it's an idea historians and scientists have had no real problem with, even after the biggest bad the world has ever known appropriated some of these ideas on their way to trying to take over the world, right? Because history today kindly lets us know that the final development of the word Viking, the ethnicization of it, really takes off after the Second World War. All right, and so in the wake of all of this DNA research and the way they're spreading the word about it and how much effort they're putting into the racism angle of these findings is what drew me into this story. All right, 1 minute, I'm happier than a pig in shit playing around in my Baltimore slop, and the next minute I'm like, because this story stinks, right? Everything from the timing of it, just a few months before the powers that be pulled off perhaps their greatest bait and switch act of the last 40 or 50 years, to what it could mean for the British royal family, and also to how it could relate to the state of modern identity politics, right? Because this story and how it's being pimped is a prime example of how malleable our history is, or can be. How easily it can be molded and shaped to manufacture political and social agendas, right? Because the writer of this article practically admits that this guy was made up, a fantasy tailor-made for the creation of these idiots. And so if this is a fabrication, if all of this is true, maybe everything we know about the Vikings is false. What do we really know about the Vikings, and how do we know it? Which Drapers supplied the fabric for this suit of lies, right? Because the Drapers are definitely connected to this story in more than a metaphorical way. Right? We've talked about the Drapers a little bit in the past, and just quickly, they are one of the 12 great livery companies, right? And they're known as the Master and Wardens and Brethren and Sisters, or Fraternity of the Blessed Mary the Virgin of the Mystery of Drapers of the City of London. And so not only does the Virgin Mary's association with the Drapers connect them to Baal to Rome and the Basilica, but perhaps also to the worship of Diana or Artemis, as we've talked about. Because let's not forget that monarchs can be Drapers too. And this is a list of 4 monarchs who, when they were born, were not expected to be crowned, right? And top of the list is William of Orange. Right? And so that's really incredible, not to mention the late Queen Elizabeth, who really started this whole story with them trying to link her to Rollo. Right? But also Prince Albert, Duke of York, who went on to become King George VI. But perhaps most importantly to this story is Prince Karl of Denmark, who went on to be King Haakon VII of Norway. He was king of Norway for 52 years, from November 1905 until his death in September 1957. You think this guy had anything to say about the Viking culture being appropriated by white nationalists if the final development of the Viking, the ethnicization of the Viking, didn't take place until after World War II? Maybe we'll find out down the line, but again, this story feels like deliberate spin control. And so I want to know how we know the things that we know about the Vikings. Not so much what we know about the Vikings. That's largely irrelevant to me in the story I'm trying to tell. Though, of course, we will be touching on all of that because, like most of what we understand about our history, the Viking story starts with the evidence. And that's the written word and archaeological discoveries. Right? And this is really incredible, right? This ship here, which was found in 1880, remains the most significant Viking Age find. Right? They have yet to find any more significant a discovery than this in over 140 years. Talk about a stat that makes my apophenia run right to the idea that the Vikings are a historical con job, right? It's a claim like that, right? And when you look at things like their helmets, these helmets look as impractical as other Dark Age and medieval knight helmets. That is, of course, unless you're, I don't know, a worm knight? This is unbelievable. Because the Vikings allegedly had a boneless warrior, right? This Ivar the Boneless, right? He was a leader in Ireland and Scotland in the mid-late 9th century. Right? And he founded the Imar dynasty, and whose descendants would go on to dominate the Irish Sea region for several centuries. Right? And he ruled Northumbria, right, from the city of York. And so let that sink in in terms of how the Vikings could relate to the British royal family, right? That's absolutely incredible that the boneless Aimar should rule from York. But most of what we know about the Vikings comes from the sagas and the Eddas, which, as discussed, were originally quasi-historical and mythological oral traditions allegedly first written down some few hundred years after the Viking Age. It's from them that we get most of our understanding of Norse mythology, right? And early Viking kings and early Viking lifestyles and so forth, right? But the sagas have a very curious Latin addition that, as far as Mud City is concerned, casts even further suspicion on the authenticity of the Viking story. And that's the inclusion of an old Icelandic translation of Roman history called the Rómverja Saga. And so the Rómverja Saga is an anthology of these 3 Latin texts that give an account of Roman history from the Jurgenthine War of 112 BC to the death of Augustus Caesar in 14 Common Era, right? And this is this combination of sources is unique in medieval literature, meaning that they're not combined in this way anywhere else, right? And that along with these 3 other sagas, they represent the earliest phase of translation of secular works into the Old Norse Icelandic. And so this is interesting for a number of reasons, but given the bias of Mud City, maybe the most interesting one is that it represents the presence of the Catholic Church. Remember, the main event that ended the Viking Age wasn't some war or great flood or pestilence. It was the absorption of the Vikings into Christendom. Or so the narrative tells us anyway. And if there's one thing we know around here, it's that the church is largely, if not completely, responsible for shaping the history of what we think of as the Western world, because it's the church that created the university system of knowledge disbursement still in use today, finding a much more profound way to exert influence over the people than the church alone ever could. Right? And this is a map of all the major universities in about the year 1500 or so. And every single one of them was chartered either directly by papal decree or by a Holy Roman Emperor. Right? And these universities were fed all their knowledge by the monastery system and their scriptoriums. Right? And a scriptorium was literally a place for writing. And it's commonly used to refer to as a room in a medieval European monastery devoted to the writing, copying, and illuminating of manuscripts commonly handled by monastic scribes. These early universities got all their books from people like the Benedictine monks. These scriptoriums were grindhouses, churning out copy after copy of books that make up most of our understanding of what the ancient Hellenistic and Roman world was like, because the oldest known copies of works like, for example, Plato's Dialogues come from scriptoriums. And this is the oldest known manuscript of Plato's Dialogues, called the Tetralogies. And allegedly this edition was completed in November of 895 of the Common Era. Right? Now, Plato is a name that I pulled out of thin air, right? It's just the first name that came to me when I wanted to reference a classical writer. And it's no coincidence that this is the book that the gatekeepers led me to in my quest to find out just how fake these books could be, because the oldest known manuscript was copied by one Johannes Calligraphus. And I could find no other reference of him anywhere. There's no other manuscripts attributed to him. There's no mention of him in any of the gatekeepers' search engines, other than that he was the one who transcribed this edition of Plato's Tetralogies. And since his name literally translates to John of the Fancy Letters, I doubt that this was ever a real person. Who knows? And regardless, the story goes that Johnny Letters here copied this book for one Areithus of Caesarea in 895 CE or AD, or however they need to all get up to speed on this one. And so, right, the interesting thing about Areithus is that he loves himself some codices. The codices that he produces and the commentaries that he leaves in them are credited with preserving many ancient texts, including those of our boy Plato and Marcus Aurelius, among others. And so when they say that he's a commentator in these codices, what that means is that he leaves annotations in the borders and the margins called scholia. All right, and this is sort of an example of what they look like. They're in the margins, and some of these old books, there's more scholia on them than there is actual texts. It's really kind of amazing. And so one of the writers that Areithus leaves commentaries on is Lucian. All right, and here he is. And he was a Hellenized Syrian satirist, rhetorician, and pamphleteer who is best known for his characteristic tongue-in-cheek style, with which he frequently ridiculed superstition, religious practices, and belief in the paranormal. And this is really interesting because he's writer of what they consider to be the first science fiction novel. which was called A True Story, and which features voyages to the moon and Venus, has these aliens fighting each other with interplanetary warfare. There's artificial life, and all of this is almost 2,000 years before Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, right? And this is interesting, seeing how this Viking DNA story is playing out as science fiction in the Mud City paradigm. But I also include Lucian because he's a prime example of fiction becoming history in our narrative, just like our Viking friend here, right? Because the narrative tells us that Lucian was a real flesh and blood person, right? His wiki page presents a detailed history for him that is endless. But it turns out that everything that is known about Lucian's history comes from his own writings, right? And he is not mentioned in any contemporary accounts or inscriptions. And British classicist Donald Russell states that a good deal of what Lucian says about himself is no more to be trusted than the voyage to the moon that he recounts so persuasively in the first person in True Stories. And he warns that it is foolish to treat the information given about himself in his writings as autobiography. Yet, like I said, this gatekeeper's account of him goes on and on, presenting him as an identifiable human person, which he is not, right? So that's not confusing at all, right? But if they're going to put this guy out there as real, then why couldn't they have done that with the Vikings? And could the idea of Lucian as a person have been fostered by Arethusa in his Scalia? How much of what we believe we know about guys like Lucian here and Plato come from sources 1,000 or more years after their alleged lifespans, dropped into the narrative by bishops or monks like Arethusa, or people like Johnny Letters? There's just no way to know, because the timeline that they have created for us pushes these events and people so far beyond any living memory. Who knows how much of our history has been erased or falsified, or even if this book is a genuine 9th century copy. It could be an early 19th century forgery, because this manuscript has a very interesting chain of possession. Right, sometime between the inventory of 1382 and 1581, 1582, so the 200 years between inventories, right? It says that the manuscript was purchased by the monastery of St. John the Theologian on the island of Patmos, and that in 1801, E.D. Clark purchased it from the monastery and donated it to the Bodleian Library, which is where it's preserved today. And this E.D. Clark is a very interesting character, right? He was born in Sussex, because of course he's from Sussex, right? And he was an English clergyman, naturalist, mineralogist, and traveler, right? And we know all about these travelers. And he was of considerable use in securing for England the statues, sarcophagi, maps, and manuscripts like the Clark Codex. Right? This guy's role in establishing what we think we know about the ancient world cannot be understated. Fast Eddie is the prototype for Indiana Jones. His story is that incredible. Because Fast Eddie is an agent for these guys, right? The Society of Antiquaries of London, right? And it's a learned society ratified by Royal Charter in 1751 with the purpose for the encouragement, advancement, and furtherance of the study and knowledge of the antiquities and history of this and other countries. For the crown. And, it's in this capacity that he travels through Russia and the Crimea to Constantinople, Rhodes, and afterwards to Egypt and Palestine. And it's his job to fill the Antiquarian Society's coffers with treasures from the past. And he's very good at his job, right? Too good. In fact, he's so good, he may have unintentionally blown the Mud City paradigm wide open. The puzzle tree has rewarded me with fruitful goodness in the shape of Fast Eddie Clark, who deserves a series all his own based just on this presentation. The Tomb of Alexander, a dissertation on the sarcophagus brought from Alexandria, now on display in the British Museum. And he presented this dissertation to the British Museum, and I'm sure to other antiquarian societies, in 1805. And it's the incredible account of how Fast Eddie came to bring what he believes to be the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great to Britain. And this is where the story starts to get interesting, because it gives us an opportunity to discuss the credibility of Fast Eddie and these antiquarian societies, right? Because Eddie gives this sarcophagus the hard sell in his paper that this is the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great. But Natch, it's not Alexander's sarcophagus at all. And today, they call it a bathtub, right? Sarcophagus, bathtub, right? And they also say that this is actually the sarcophagus for this guy, Nectanebo II, right? And we're going to get back to him a little bit later on, right? So the questions I have are these. Was Fast Eddie just taken in by all the stories about the sarcophagus that he recounts with great detail in this presentation? Swindled by the local dirt merchants looking to grab a little of that proverbial fat cash from their new British occupiers because a good chunk of Fast Eddie's antiquity gathering comes after the British deposed Napoleon's forces from Egypt. And Napoleon's connection to Egypt and to Baltimore is not lost on me in the wake of all of this and what's to come, right? And so, was Fast Eddie just taken in by the stories of the locals that they were also selling to the French? Or did Fast Eddie help create this Alexandrian sarcophagus story in an effort to help gain public interest in the narrative that they were trying to push? Because early on in this dissertation, he says something very curious to me. In talking about when the first Egyptian artifacts were arriving in England, he says this, right? He says that they were placed in the open court of the British Museum and considered as curious but unimportant monuments of Egyptian art, right? They were unimportant, right? But they were glorious to the nation as trophies of its valor, but whose dark and mystic legends, impervious to modern inquiry, excited despair rather than hope of explanation. So either the general public didn't care about these artifacts, or they were afraid or distrusting of them, and so maybe they needed a little enticement, a little pizzazz, in order to embrace these artifacts which were just being introduced to support the ancient history narrative that the Royal Societies and their academic brethren were trying to push. Like the story of Alexander's tomb, which is a tale of high adventure that I wish I could bring you more of, but in this presentation, Fast Eddie goes into great detail about the deification process of Alexander the Great. The turning of Alexander from a human man into an Egyptian god, which in the eyes of the Egyptian people is exactly what happened to him when he conquered Egypt and was made pharaoh, because pharaohs were gods on earth. Right? So Fast Eddie reckons that Alexander was well aware of this when he was choosing his avatars, because he uses different avatars, and all of this is in regard to how they identify the sarcophagus as Alexander's. Because the point is that for such an important place like his tomb, he would use his real image instead of one of these other gods that he combines himself with, like Minerva on his gold medals, or Jupiter Ammon, with which he's represented with the horns of a ram. Not to mention Bacchus, who also rocks the ram-horned look. There are lots of depictions of Alexander rocking the goat horns, right? Especially on his money. And so in his deified form, Alexander the Great is a goat man. And it's also interesting that the fossils known as Ammonites get their name from the Ammons, whether it's Jupiter Ammon or Zeus Ammon or Baal Ammon. It's all the same-ish supreme deity, and they're represented by the Fibonacci sequence, or something that closely resembles the Fibonacci sequence anyway, and I think this is pretty incredible. But it was in reading Fast Eddie's account of Alexander's deification and following up on that my fat senses took off, right? Because I learned that Alexander the Great is also featured in the Quran as a goat man. Alexander the Great being referred to in the Quran as the two-horned man, a reference to his depiction on Middle Eastern coins and statuary as having horns of Ammon. And so, of course, I don't know anything about the Quran, so in doing my diligence on that, I learned that it was allegedly transcribed between 610 and 632 Common Era, or the early 7th century, as the narrative spins our timeline today, right? And these dates are interesting numerically because when you add them, you get a 7 and an 11, right? 6 plus 1 is 7, 6 plus 3 plus 2 is 11, right? And so the Quran is another one of those perfect gateways. And it was here I had my apophonetic epiphany around these dates because of how close they are to when the Catholics got their scriptoriums up and running, just about 100 years before the Quran is allegedly written. And so if these scriptoriums were meant to or could be used as sources of revenue, as it says down here, St. Jerome stated that the products of the scriptorium could be a source of revenue for the monastic community, then you need to create streams for these revenue sources. You already have your own empire on lockdown, supplying Bibles to your own churches for what I'm sure is just a modest profit, right? But what if you could create a brand new, extremely profitable revenue stream by exploiting a marketplace you knew to be ripe for the picking because you had had a presence there for some 700 years or so already? You would do it. And that marketplace would have been the Eastern Byzantine parts of your empire, most notably Saudi Arabia. Because Christianity wasn't really taking hold in these regions where the people were more prone to the pagan and Abrahamic elements of faith, right? They weren't so interested in your newfangled Christianity. So what if you could concoct a new religion? One that embraces the local pagan element of the jinn, along with the Abrahamic elements of Judaism, and you pepper in a little bit of your Jesus Christo as well. And if you played it right, you've killed at least 3 birds with 1 stone, right? Because you've created a revenue stream for your nearby scriptoriums, who will reproduce the texts and books this new religion would need. You would also create revenue streams for different rivers in your empire, most notably the military-industrial complex river. And just how profitable the Crusades were for the church, we may never know, right? And so not only have you created revenue streams and a potential enemy for yourself, but in perhaps the greatest example of trolling in history, you've also created an enemy for your enemy. And so much of this idea hit me because of the detail Fast Eddie goes into about the history, for whatever that's worth, of Alexander the Great. Because in this dissertation, Fast Eddie says things like this, that the Arabs would suffer no Christian to approach the sarcophagus on pain of death, and that Jews as a people were more despised by the Mahatmans, meaning the Muslims, than the Christians. So the Muslims hated the Jews more than the Christians did, eh?
How convenient!
That's interesting because the Quran is allegedly a transcription of Muhammad's revelation from Allah given to him by the angel Gabriel, right? And Gabriel is the guardian angel of Israel, right? Defending its people against the angels of other nations. Why would God/Allah use the guardian angel protector of Israel to deliver his final prophecies to a man whose followers would be enemies of Israel? Did God not see that coming? Was he trolling Gabriel here or the Israelites with this little stunt? Because it just doesn't make sense, right? Just one of God's mysterious ways, I suppose, right? And this idea that the Roman Catholics created Islam gains a little more traction because Muhammad was allegedly from Mecca, right? And Mecca was one of the areas under Roman control. And then there's the curious story of Muhammad meeting a Christian monk when he was 12. And this Christian monk, Bahira, prophesied about Muhammad's future as a prophet of God. And so given this idea that the Roman Catholics may have created Islam, this idea kind of reads like maybe this was his indoctrination, right? How much of Muhammad's prophecy was handed to him by this Christian monk? Was he given the Quran and said, memorize this for later? Who knows? I don't know. But puberty is the right age for these things, isn't it? And of course, this whole idea of the Roman Catholics creating Islam is complete speculation, an idea that needs a lot of work, right? And for now, it's just my apophenia running wild. But it would go a long way to explaining or helping to explain how Rome in America, Baal to Rome, has a star fort that points directly to Mecca. Talk about a mystery that I didn't expect to be a part of this Viking story, let alone finding a possible explanation for. I think this is absolutely incredible. And I'm not done, right? Because Fast Eddie's endless bloviating about the deification of Alexander has more to offer on just how connected Alexander is to the Christian story, and how false that thing could be as well. Because Fast Eddie tells us that Alexander died when he was 33. What a coinkydink, right? That's the age that Jesus Christu was when he died. And it gets better, right? With all of Fast Eddie's talk of the deification of Alexander, it turns out that the sarcophagus he's convinced is Alexander's was housed in a mosque in Alexandria that used to be a Catholic church. The Adarene Mosque, which is also known as the Mosque of St. Athanasius. Not Athanasius, like our friend Athanasius Kircher, the super Jesuit natural philosopher and polymath who independently translated the Egyptian hieroglyphs without the benefit of the Rosetta Stone, and whom some refer to as the father of Egyptology. I'm guessing it's St. Athanasius that he's named after. And St. Athanasius was the 20th Pope of Alexandria, meaning he was the 20th Pope of the Greek Orthodox Church. And not only was he allegedly present at the First Council of Nicaea, he allegedly was the scribe for the Nicene Creed. And just to refresh our memories on what the Council of Nicaea was for, right, according to the mainstream narrative, Constantine, who was the first Christian Roman emperor, ordered bishops from across his realm to go to Nicaea, where they ironed out enough of Christianity's problems that he was able to insert it as the state religion of the Roman Empire. And that Athanasius was such a big part of this creation of Christianity as the state religion for the Roman Empire, is enough to make me wonder just how much of the story of Jesus Christo is merely coded Alexandrian mythology, right? Because Presumably, Athanasius here would have been holding sacred Alexandrian knowledge. And I think it's amazing that all of this came from me looking at whether or not they faked the story of the Vikings to create bad guys like these idiots, right? Which has led to the idea that the Catholic Church may have created Islam, right, through the use of scriptoriums. Because in order for Islam to spread as fast as it did, it would have needed a lot of help. At least that's the way I'm thinking about it here, right? Because allegedly the Quran isn't finished until Muhammad dies, right? Which is in 632 Common Era. Yet in only 9 years, the Muslim faith is strong enough to be a conquering force, right? On November 8th, 641 AD, Alexandria fell into Muslim control. How did they get so big so fast, right? It just seems like they would have needed help spreading the word, but, what do I know, right? And so to close this one out, we're going to talk a little bit about the guy that the historical narrative tells us this sarcophagus really belonged to, and that's Nectanebo II. Now, I didn't read how they made this determination that this is the sarcophagus of Nectanebo II, just that that's what the British Museum is now saying about this sarcophagus. All right, from the British Museum. And Nectanebo is a very interesting character in and of himself. The last legit bloodline pharaoh. And I don't think it's a coincidence the way they have the numerals here, making that represent an 11, because it's clear that Nectanebo II is a gateway pharaoh, because after him, all the pharaohs are Hellenized, with Alexander ultimately becoming the pharaoh around 332 BC. And according to some Egyptian religious practices, in order for Alexander to assume the throne of Egypt, he needs to be related to a bloodline dynastic pharaoh, one like, say, Nectanebo. And the record provides such a story in what is known as the Alexandrian romances. There is an apocryphal tale appearing in the pseudo-historical Alexander romance that details another end for the last native pharaoh. Soon after Alexander the Great's godhood was confirmed by the Libyan sibyl of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis, a rumor was begun that Nectanebo II, following defeat in his last battle, did not travel to Nubia, but instead to the court of Philip II of Macedon, in the guise of an Egyptian magician. There, while Philip was away on campaign, Nectanebo convinced Philip's wife Olympias that Amun was to come to her and that they would father a son. Nectanebo, disguising himself as Amun, slept with Olympias, and from this event came Alexander. This myth would hold strong appeal for the Egyptians, who desired continuity and harbored a strong dislike for foreign rule. In art of this event, Nectanebo is usually depicted as having dragon-like features, for example, in the Speculum Historiale. And I have this picture here, and here it is, right? And here's Nectanebo, starring as the dragon in the mystery play of the Rape of Olympias, Alexander the Great's mother. And the amazing thing about this is that dragons are worms by another name, right? So this story makes Alexander a worm knight. And this is really incredible, considering the way that the worm knights have sort of inserted themselves into this whole story of the Vikings and so forth, right? And so not only is Nectanebo the last Egyptian bloodline pharaoh and gateway to the Ptolemaic era, the popularity of this story during the Renaissance was such that the creator of the oldest known complete tarot deck, the Sola Busca deck, which allegedly dates to the late 1400s, incorporates him as the Knight of Cups. The Knight of Cups, Nectanebo, was an Egyptian priest and magician. And let's not forget Pharaoh. And this whole Sola Busca tarot is steeped in Alexandrian mystery traditions, right? The key figure, they say, is the man himself, Alexander, and he's the King of Swords. And here he is, suited up with these weird llama-like griffin creatures, kind of flanking him. He's the King of Swords, and his mother, Olympias, who Nectanebo rapes to create Alexander, right? She's the Queen of Swords. And it doesn't stop here. I could go on all day with this, but the amazing thing about Nectanebo being the Knight of Cups is what the Knight of Cups represents in the tarot. Now, there are lots of different interpretations for what these cards could mean, depending on the deck and the reader. But the gatekeepers gave me the perfect definition for this story. Right? It says that the Knight of Cups, when upright, represents change and new excitements, particularly of a romantic nature. But the Knight of Cups can also mean invitations, opportunities, and offers. The Knight of Cups is a person who is a bringer of ideas, opportunities, and offers. He is constantly bored and is in constant need of stimulation, but also artistic and refined. he represents a person who is amiable, intelligent, and full of high principles, but a dreamer who can be easily persuaded or discouraged. And so not only can this be characteristic of Nectanebo, who is the bringer of change from bloodline pharaohs to Hellenistic pharaohs, but it also suits the man who brought us here, Fast Eddie Clark, right, who brings change and new excitements to the British Empire with his antiquarian efforts, and who may or may not be involved in the forging of what we think of as our ancient history with these fantastic stories and unique purchases. Which brings us back around to how this whole thing got started. Could the inclusion of the Rome Vera saga among the other Icelandic sagas be an indication of Roman hands in the creation of the Vikings? And could some of the old manuscripts be outright forgeries used to spread a false historical narrative they could then in turn manipulate for further use later? We're going to take a closer look at that, and I'm sure a whole lot more, in the next mountain-moving episode. But if the esoteric rule of reversal holds true for our scriptwriters, then I think the answers will be pretty clear. Because the Knight of Cups, when he's reversed, indicates fraud, false promises, and trickery. Right? It represents a person who has trouble discerning when and where the truth ends and lies begin. All right, that's what I have for this one. Remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies. And so until the next one, cheers.